I stood by the window, observing my father as he loaded the suitcases into the trunk of his car, silently. Earlier that morning, he had mentioned he would be gone for a few days but didn't provide any reason for his departure. It struck me as odd. He usually gave me a heads up when he planned to be away for an extended period. With each passing second, a growing sense of anxiety swelled within me. When the door slammed shut behind him, my stepmother, Sophie, shot up from the table so suddenly that her chair fell over. I turned to her, hoping for at least some sort of explanation, but she walked into the living room without saying a word. I could sense that something was amiss. I knew it deep down. I could feel it, yet I couldn't articulate why. Never before had I felt such an icy atmosphere in our home as I did that day. My father had rushed out, and Sophie seemed completely out of sorts. There was something in her eyes that eluded my understanding. The silence in the house felt almost suffocating. Days passed, yet the odd tension that had developed between Sophie and me in the barn lingered, unresolved. I attempted to spend time away from home to avoid her, but it proved difficult. Every interaction with her brought back memories of that unsettling conversation. It was clear something had shifted between us, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophie unexpectedly approached me in the kitchen while I sat at the table, engrossed in my phone as she prepared tea. "Would you like to go for a walk?" Her tone was surprisingly gentle. I was taken aback by her suggestion. We rarely spent time together, and I couldn't fathom why she would want to now. "I don't know," I muttered, still staring at my phone. "Where to?" "Let's head to the old factory across the river," she said, setting a steaming cup of tea in front of me. "It feels like the perfect time to go," she added. The old factory, not far from our home, lay beyond the hill and the river where locals once worked but now stood abandoned. I had always found the place eerie and desolate, yet there was something alluring about it, as if it held long-lost secrets. For reasons I couldn't quite grasp, I found myself agreeing. I nodded, perhaps out of curiosity about her motives for wanting to visit. We quickly got ready and stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The sun was setting, casting the sky in deep pink and orange hues. We walked in silence, but it wasn't awkward, just a heavy silence filled with unspoken words. When we reached the river, I paused at the bridge and gazed at the water. The evening was peaceful, with only a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. "Did you come here often?" I inquired, hoping my question might lighten the mood. "I did once," Sophie replied, stepping closer and staring at the distant factory. "This place reminds me of how much simpler things used to be." I remained silent, listening to her. There was a note of nostalgia in her voice that hinted at longing for something lost. We crossed the old wooden bridge and approached the factory. The towering walls, collapsed roofs, and rusted metal structures created a somber atmosphere. Everything felt suspended in time, and the silence was almost oppressive as we arrived at the old gates leading into the factory's courtyard. Sophie paused and looked at me. "Sometimes I think all our problems are just mistakes from the past that we can't let go of," she said, as if her words applied to both of us. I was at a loss for words. Her unexpected statement hinted at deeper issues, something personal that she was grappling with. In that moment, surrounded by the crumbling walls, I understood that something unusual had been brewing between us for quite some time. It was something I had failed to recognize before. We walked closer to the wall, and Sophie settled onto an old concrete block. I stood next to her, looking down at her. Her eyes were filled with thoughts, and I sensed she wanted to share something important but hesitated. "Have you ever thought about losing control over your life?" she suddenly asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared at her, unsure how to respond. The question caught me off guard, weighing heavily in the air. "Sometimes," I answered slowly, "but I try not to dwell on it." Sophie nodded, and for a moment, silence enveloped us once more. The wind picked up, and suddenly, I felt her presence more acutely, as if the world around us had faded, leaving only the two of us. It was a peculiar sensation that I couldn't shake. "Sometimes I just want to leave," she admitted softly, her gaze far away. I want to escape and forget everything. Leave behind all that suffocates me. I found myself at a loss for words. My mind raced as I realized her words held more than a simple desire to flee. They were a cry for help I couldn't ignore, yet I felt ill-equipped to address. At that moment, she rose and stepped closer to me. I felt an undeniable tension building between us, and it frightened me. Sophie paused for a second, her sad eyes locked onto mine, and then, without a word, moved even nearer. In the blink of an eye, her lips brushed against mine, and the entire world seemed to freeze around us. It was nothing like I had imagined. The moment was quiet yet undeniably significant, as if she had made a choice that couldn't be undone. When she pulled away, I found myself at a loss for words. We stood there in silence, surrounded by the gray walls of the old factory, and it dawned on me that nothing would ever be the same between us. As we walked back home through the desolate factory grounds, the silence became almost tangible. Sophie walked beside me, but her mind seemed to drift far away. After our kiss near the crumbling walls, I struggled to organize my thoughts. I was uncertain about what it meant or how to proceed. Sophie hadn't said anything after our lips met. She had merely stepped back as if nothing had occurred. Honestly, it was bewildering. My heart raced so loudly that I feared she might hear it. Everything felt surreal as we continued in silence, trying to make sense of the situation. I should have spoken up. I should have taken a step back and acknowledged that this was wrong. Yet, inexplicably, I walked alongside her in silence. As we reached the edge of the factory, where the overgrown path to our home began, Sophie suddenly halted and turned to me. Her eyes sparkled in the fading light, revealing something I had never noticed before. It wasn't the cold, guarded look I was accustomed to. Instead, there was something raw vulnerability, perhaps, or fear. "I'm sorry," she murmured, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled, which was unusual for her. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. That apology made me feel even more uncomfortable. "For what?" I asked, even though I knew deep down what she was apologizing for. She averted her gaze, nervously running her fingers through her hair. In that moment, it became clear to me that she was just as lost as I was. For hesitating, she began but didn't finish. Taking a deep breath, she continued, "For what I shouldn't have done." My mind raced with questions. What did she mean? She shouldn't have kissed me. She shouldn't have said those things. "Sophie." I started trying to articulate my thoughts. I didn't get to finish because she raised her hand, signaling that she didn't want to hear any excuses. "Please don't," she interrupted. "It's all too complicated. I just don't know how to explain it." I fell silent again, uncertain of how to reply. Our conversation felt more like two people ensnared in a bizarre situation with no straightforward way out. At that moment, I didn't want to complicate things any further. "Maybe we should just go home," I suggested, hoping it might alleviate some of the tension. Sophie looked at me with a hint of sadness in her eyes but nodded in agreement. We continued down the path together. The wind picked up, and I noticed her pulling her thin jacket closer, as if trying to shield herself. Not just from the chill, but from the weight of what had transpired. I attempted to convince myself that it had merely been a fleeting moment of weakness. Nothing more. We both understood it was wrong, and she had even tried to apologize. Perhaps we could leave it at that. Yet something inside me screamed that it wasn't that simple. The kiss, her words, everything had raised too many questions I wasn't prepared to confront. By the time we returned home, night had fully enveloped the world outside. Sophie paused at the porch and regarded me as though she wanted to say something crucial. I froze, waiting for her to speak. "Listen," she began. "Let's just forget this ever happened. Please, we can't let this continue." Her voice was firm, but I could detect a plea beneath it. I felt the internal conflict rising again. On one hand, I knew she was right. On the other, another voice in my head urged me to fight against simply letting it go. "Yeah," I finally forced out, though the words felt insincere. "That's probably for the best." She sighed in relief, but her face remained tense. It felt like we were trapped in a game that neither of us wanted to play, yet we were already too deep into it. Once inside, the silence that greeted us felt even more oppressive than before. My father was still away, and his absence seemed to magnify the growing distance between Sophie and me. I wanted to retreat to my room and erase the events of the day from my mind, but she stopped me at the kitchen doorway. "Oliver." Her voice was soft again, yet more assured than before. "Let's put an end to this right here. Nothing else will happen." I nodded, but her words gnawed at me. "Nothing else will happen." It sounded so final, yet I knew it wasn't that simple. "All right," I replied, not really convinced that she was certain. We both attempted to convince ourselves that this was the conclusion, but the tension hanging in the air suggested otherwise. I ascended the stairs, leaving her alone in the kitchen. Lying in bed, I tossed and turned for what felt like ages. Her words, that kiss, and the emotions I was struggling to suppress whirled around in my mind. Something inside me resisted, as if I were unaware of what I truly desired. In the middle of the night, I awoke with an odd sensation. I approached the window and saw Sophie standing on the porch, wrapped in a blanket and gazing off into the distance. There was something about her silhouette that made my heart tighten. I felt a strong urge to go to her, but I managed to hold myself back just in time. The next day, I made a conscious effort to avoid Sophie. My father was still away, and the tension that had been building between us felt almost palpable. I would leave the house early each morning and return late in the evening, hoping to escape the relentless thoughts that kept creeping into my mind. Yet no matter how hard I tried, something within me refused to let go. I knew I couldn't run from this for much longer. By evening, I resolved to head to the old garage, a little farther from the house. It was abandoned and had become one of those places where I could find solitude with my thoughts. I settled on a wooden bench against the wall, watching the sunset through the cracks in the structure. This corner reminded me of simpler days, when there wasn't a heavy burden looming over my life. Then I heard the door of the garage creak open, and my heart raced. Sophie stood in the doorway, her silhouette sharply defined against the dimming light. I flinched, caught off guard by her presence. She quietly closed the door behind her and moved closer, sitting softly on the bench beside me. We remained silent, just the sound of the wind outside filling the void. "I thought you ran away from me," she finally said, her voice soft yet laced with a peculiar sadness. I didn't know what to say. I admitted, feeling the tension between us intensify with each passing second. Sophie looked at me, and in her gaze, I noticed uncertainty. It was strange to see her this way. She usually exuded calmness and composure, but something had shifted within her. Her eyes searched mine, and when our gazes connected, the silence between us felt like it was screaming. "We need to talk," she said quietly, averting her eyes once more. "I can't ignore this. We can't just pretend nothing happened." I recognized she was right, yet I was terrified of what she might say. I feared it would alter everything even more than it already had. "It was wrong," she continued, her voice trembling, "but I don't know what to do. I don't know how to stop this." We fell silent again. I struggled to find the words. Everything happening felt wrong, yet I couldn't shake the thoughts that had tormented me since that moment. I knew she was waiting for a response, but what could I possibly say?
"I'm sorry."
"It was a mistake," I said, but I understood those words wouldn't change anything. Sophie stood up and slowly walked toward the garage window, pausing by the cracked glass where the fading light filtered through. I watched as her dark silhouette blended into the surroundings, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had both crossed a line. "I just don't want it to happen again," she said without turning to face me. But when she finally did turn around, I saw in her eyes that things had already progressed too far for us to simply retreat. Sophie took a few steps closer to me, stopping just within reach where I could hear her breathing. "This is wrong," she whispered, but I could tell from her expression that she didn't truly believe her own words. At that moment, a pause hung between us that felt like it lasted forever. I couldn't explain what compelled me, but suddenly, I stood up and moved closer to her. She didn't back away. Our eyes locked, and I felt the tension between us finally erupt. It was as if a decision had been made in an instant, and the next moment, our lips met again. The kiss was gentle, almost ephemeral. It wasn't like the first. There was no urgency or shock. This time, it felt intentional, as though we both understood the implications. She didn't pull away immediately, and in that moment, time seemed to stretch. All I could hear was our breathing, everything else around us fading into oblivion. When she finally stepped back, her eyes were filled with questions, but she didn't voice any of them. We stood there, locked in a gaze, aware that we had crossed another boundary, and neither of us knew how to turn back. "We need to stop this," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. I didn't reply, uncertain of what to say. Inside, I was screaming that she was right, yet I also knew this wouldn't erase what had already transpired. The day after our kiss in the garage, I decided it was time to end this. I recognized that this was the wrong path, and I needed to find a way to stop it. The situation had spiraled too far, yet despite my resolve, turmoil churned within me. Sophie and I had crossed a line that would be hard to return from. Every time I tried to convince myself we could forget and move on, I realized I was only deceiving myself. I spent the entire day outside, wandering through the woods behind our house. Nature always calmed me and helped clear my thoughts. The trees rustled gently in the wind, and I felt a slight sense of clarity within. I walked along the path that followed the old stream, leading deeper into the woods. With each step, I assured myself that I would find the right words to explain everything to Sophie. We had to put a stop to this before it destroyed everything around us. By evening, I returned home to the familiar quietness. My father was still delayed in the city for a few more days, giving Sophie and me time to sort things out. I walked into the kitchen and spotted her by the window, lost in her thoughts. She hadn't heard me enter. She held a cup of tea, though it was evident she had forgotten about it. The liquid had gone cold and no steam rose from the cup. Her gaze seemed distant, focused somewhere far beyond the kitchen. "Sophie?" I said softly, causing her to flinch. She turned to face me, her eyes narrowing as if she anticipated a difficult conversation she wasn't prepared for. We stood in silence for several seconds, neither of us able to decide who should break the quiet. I knew I needed to say something significant, but all my words felt inadequate. She stepped closer, and the familiar tension between us returned. "We need to talk," I finally stated, trying to sound firm. She set her cup down on the table and approached me, her expression serious. For a moment, I thought she might also want to end everything and that we would find a way to return to normalcy. But there was something in her eyes that worried me. "You're right," she replied quietly, almost in a whisper. "We really do need to talk." I opened my mouth to continue, but then she stepped closer, her hand lightly resting on my shoulder. The gesture was subtle, yet it conveyed more than words ever could. We fell silent again, and the unbearable tension around us seemed to engulf everything. I realized we were standing at the edge of something significant, and this moment would dictate what happened next. "This is wrong," I finally managed to say, but my words sounded unconvincing, as if I didn't fully believe them myself. She nodded, but her eyes remained locked onto mine. I wanted to add something else, but there was no time. Sophie took a step forward and gently grasped my hand. I felt her fingers slowly squeeze mine, and my thoughts began to swirl. Her touch was light, almost ethereal, yet there was a profound weight in it that left me paralyzed. "We shouldn't be doing this," I whispered again, knowing how futile it sounded. At that moment, she lifted her hand and brushed my cheek gently. The touch felt almost accidental, but it changed everything. Her fingers glided against my skin, and I felt my throat go dry. I stood frozen, unsure of what would happen next. But as she leaned in closer, I knew I could stop this, yet I didn't take a step back. The kiss took me by surprise, yet it was soft, like a gentle breeze in early autumn. This time, it didn't resemble the previous kisses. Everything felt different. There was no urgency, and its tenderness was bewildering. I felt her hand slide from my cheek to my shoulder, again without haste, just a connection I couldn't quite put into words. When she finally pulled away, Time seemed to freeze once more. We stood in silence again, unsure of what to do next. Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment, and then she opened them, looking directly at me. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted, confusion lacing her voice. I realized I didn't know how to stop either. It felt like falling into an abyss, aware that I shouldn't venture any further, yet unable to hold back. "We shouldn't," I began, but she halted me with her gaze. "I know," she said softly, and I saw the same turmoil reflected in her eyes. We both understood we had already crossed a line, and there was no simple way to return. I wanted to say something else, to explain that this couldn't go on, but all the words seemed futile. Instead, we remained silent, each of us grappling with our emotions. I felt as if everything around us was crumbling, and I had no idea how to fix it. The rest of the evening dragged on in an odd, heavy silence. I could feel the tension in the house intensifying with each passing minute. Sophie sat curled up on the couch in the living room, a book in her hands, though I knew she wasn't reading. Her gaze was distant, as if she were elsewhere. I couldn't find peace either. Our last conversation and that kiss had left so much unsaid, creating a heavy, invisible weight pressing down on us both. The house felt cold, despite the warmth of the summer evening outside. I decided to act as if nothing was happening and retreated to my room. But even as I tried to distract myself, the realization that we had gone too far haunted my mind. I knew I needed to find a way out of this predicament. But how? We both understood this shouldn't have happened. Yet somehow we couldn't stop. Night descended without my notice. I lay in bed, but sleep eluded me. Thoughts raced through my mind, and with each hour that passed, the feeling grew stronger that something was about to change. I lay there with my eyes shut, yet it felt as if time stretched endlessly, as if the night itself were resisting its conclusion. Just as I was about to drift off, a light knock on the door jolted me awake. My eyes flew open, and I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I immediately knew who it was. The room was shrouded in darkness, with only a faint moonlight seeping through the curtains. "Oliver," came Sophie's quiet voice, almost a whisper. I froze, feeling a knot tighten within me. Her presence outside the door felt surreal, like a dream. I understood she shouldn't be there, but I couldn't find the strength to respond. "Can I come in?" she whispered again, slightly louder this time. I nodded, even though I knew she couldn't see me. Still, she didn't need my confirmation. The door opened slowly, and she stepped inside, closing it behind her so quietly that it was nearly silent. She lingered at the threshold, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining it all. In the dim light, her silhouette appeared almost ethereal, as if she might dissolve into the shadows at any moment. "I can't sleep," she confessed after a pause, her voice distant, as though she herself was uncertain about her presence in my room at this hour. "I need to talk to you." I didn't respond verbally, but I gestured for her to sit on the chair by the wall. She hesitated for just a moment before settling down, trying to maintain some distance, which only heightened the strangeness of the situation. Her fingers nervously fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, and I realized she was just as tense as I was. "I don't know how to explain this," she began after a long silence. "What's happening? I can't make sense of it, but I know I can't keep going like this. It's too heavy." Her words echoed in my mind. I had thought the same thing countless times but struggled to articulate it. Sophie spoke calmly, yet I could see she was battling with herself, grappling with her emotions. "We both know this is wrong," she continued, "and yet something keeps pulling us back to it over and over. Why can't we stop?" I looked at her, but the answer eluded me. The words were lodged in my throat, and everything felt like a strange play where we were both acting out parts that didn't belong to us. "I've tried to understand what this means," she said, her voice rising slightly but still restrained. "And every time I come to the conclusion that we need to stop. But I can't." Sophie rose from the chair and stepped closer, standing directly in front of me. I could feel her presence with an intensity that frightened me. I wanted to speak, to step back, but I found myself rooted in place. Instead, I looked up at her, and in that moment, it felt as if everything collapsed. She slowly sat down beside me on the edge of the bed. We weren't touching, but the proximity was almost unbearable. I could see she was waiting for something, yet I didn't understand what it was. We both knew we shouldn't be continuing down this path, but neither of us could figure out how to stop. "I can't pretend this doesn't matter anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It does, and it won't just go away." Her words struck me like a sharp blade, cutting through the haze we had been trying to navigate. I realized we were trapped, unable to escape this reality. Suddenly, she gently touched my hand, her fingers warm and trembling. The touch was unexpected, but I didn't pull away. I knew I should have, yet I allowed her to continue. Her hand slid across mine, and my heart began to race. This touch felt different, almost desperate yet soft, as if she were unsure of her intentions. Our eyes locked, and in that moment, I understood that all boundaries had vanished. I leaned slightly forward, and our lips met once more. This kiss was unlike any of the others. It was slow, almost hesitant, as if we were both searching for an answer to the question that had tormented us for so long. When she pulled away, I found myself at a loss for words. All I could do was stare at her, fully aware that neither of us could ever return to how things had been before. The next few days passed in a strange haze filled with anxiety. I felt suspended between reality and something intangible, keeping my mind in a constant state of turmoil. After that night, I tried to steer clear of Sophie, but every time we crossed paths in the house, I felt her gaze on me. That look was filled with the same doubts and fears swirling in my own mind. We both understood we had crossed a line and didn't know how to retreat. One evening, while I sat on the porch with a book in my hands, unable to focus on the words, Sophie stepped outside. I heard the door creak, but I didn't turn to look. She sat beside me, and once again, silence enveloped us. We sat there for a long while, quietly watching the sunset. The tension between us became unbearable. "We can't go on like this," she suddenly said softly, breaking the silence. I placed the book on my lap, uncertain of how to respond. Her words were true. We couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. "I know," I forced out, still not looking at her. Sophie sighed heavily, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "Dad will be home soon, and I can't imagine looking him in the eye, knowing what we've done." Her voice quivered, and I could see the emotional dam inside her was about to burst. "It feels like a trap we can't escape from." I finally turned my head to meet her gaze. Sophie looked lost and drained, her eyes swollen and red as if sleep had long eluded her. Her words struck me like a reality check, reminding me that every moment we spent together only deepened our predicament. We were teetering on the edge of a cliff, unsure of how to avoid the plunge. "We really can't go on like this," I murmured, feeling a tightening in my chest. "But I don't know how to stop." Sophie dropped her gaze, running her fingers through her hair. Her shoulders sagged, as though the burden she carried was too much to bear. I felt a sharp stab of guilt, a haunting realization that we had gone too far. "I always thought I could control my feelings," she confessed, her voice growing softer. "I kept telling myself it was just a fleeting attraction that would fade away, but with each passing day, it only grows stronger." I stayed silent, struggling to find the right words. Everything felt trapped in my throat. I knew we shouldn't have crossed this line, but how could we possibly find a way out? "Dad loves you," I finally blurted out, fully aware that these words would cut deep. "We can't betray him like this." Sophie's hands clenched into fists as she shut her eyes tightly. I could see her battling her inner turmoil, trying to find a solution that wouldn't lead to catastrophe. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know it's wrong, but how do we go back, Oliver? We've gone too far." We fell silent again, lost in our thoughts, both recognizing that there was no simple escape. I wanted to hold on to the hope that we could somehow mend this, but deep down, I knew we were out of options. Suddenly, Sophie turned to me, her expression grave. "We have to end this now," she declared, her tone more assertive. "Right now, before it all crumbles to dust." I can't keep carrying this weight. I nodded, yet the words felt heavy in my mouth. I knew she was right, but a part of me clung to the thought of what we had. Sophie stepped toward the porch railing, the wind gently tugging at her hair, as if she were gathering the courage to make a pivotal choice. "Oliver," she said softly, turning to me once more, "I don't want to keep fleeing from what I feel, but I can't let this destroy everything we have. We both know this can only lead to something worse." She took a step closer, and a sharp ache pierced my chest. Sophie halted just a few steps away, her eyes filled with sorrow and an emotion I couldn't quite place. She reached out and lightly touched my cheek. The gesture caught me off guard, but it felt almost ethereal, like a gentle breeze. I didn't pull away, even though I knew I should have. Her fingers slid across my skin, and in that moment, I realized I wouldn't be able to resist what was about to unfold. Our lips met once more, but this kiss felt different. It was slow and deliberate, as if we both understood this was our final moment of closeness. There was no rush, no doubt, just an overwhelming sense that this was a goodbye. When she pulled away, tears glistened in her eyes, and I could see she was struggling to hold them back. "We have to stop this," she murmured, and I nodded again, even as every part of me rebelled against the idea. The days that followed our kiss blurred together in a haze of confusion and anxiety. Sophie barely spoke to me, and we tried to avoid each other, which was nearly impossible in such close quarters. When my father returned earlier than expected, the atmosphere grew even more strained. Every shared meal, every fleeting glance, every incidental encounter in the hallway felt loaded with unspoken tension. One evening, as the three of us sat around the table, the silence became so oppressive it felt like it might crush me. My father chatted cheerfully about work, but I struggled to focus on his words. My eyes kept drifting toward Sophie, and each time our gazes met, she quickly looked away, her face a mask of indifference. But I knew the storm brewing inside her mirrored my own turmoil. After dinner, my father retreated to his office, and I stayed behind to clear the table. Sophie approached me slowly, and for a brief moment, we were alone in the kitchen. I sensed she wanted to say something, but she hesitated. The silence was deafening. "We need to talk," she finally whispered, avoiding eye contact. I froze, holding a plate in my hands, and slowly nodded. The weight of everything we'd been through felt heavier each day, and I realized we could no longer pretend that life was normal. We stepped out onto the porch, where the cool night air offered a respite from the heat building inside me. Sophie stood next to me, arms crossed, silently grappling with her thoughts. The sky had darkened, and the stillness around us amplified the tension. "I can't do this anymore," she finally breathed. Her voice was a mere whisper, but it carried the weight of everything she hadn't been able to say before. "I thought I could manage it, but it's tearing me apart." I nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. We both understood we were at an impasse, and this moment had been a long time coming, yet every word I wanted to utter felt inadequate. "Dad can't find out," I said, even though it was painfully obvious. Sophie bit her lip and nodded, pain evident in her eyes. She could no longer hide it from me. "I tried to stop it," she murmured, "but now I don't know how we can keep living like nothing happened." My chest tightened as the weight of our predicament sank in. We had both boxed ourselves into a corner, and we knew there was no easy escape. "Oliver," she said, urgency lacing her voice, something I hadn't heard before. "I'm leaving. I have to go." Her words struck me like lightning. I struggled to grasp what she meant. Was she serious? Leaving? Leaving my father? Leaving me? A torrent of questions surged through my mind, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. "You're leaving," I stammered, disbelief flooding my voice. She nodded, determination etched on her face. "It's the only way to fix this. I love your father, but I can't carry this weight any longer." Her voice quavered, but she pressed on, as if afraid that pausing would strip her of the courage to continue. "I'm leaving tomorrow morning. I've already packed my things." My heart plummeted. Tomorrow? That was far too soon. I couldn't fathom how everything could end so abruptly. What do I tell Dad? I finally managed to ask, struggling to find the words. Tell him I'm tired, that I need time, she replied, tears welling in her eyes. He deserves the truth, but not the kind of truth that will destroy him. She stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder, and I felt that same heavy weight pressing down on us. I'm sorry, Oliver, she whispered, her voice trembling. I shouldn't have dragged you into this. I was lost for words. Nothing came to mind. Instead, I just stood there, feeling as if the world around me was collapsing. She took a step back, and in that instant, I realized everything between us was ending. Just then, the door to the house swung open, and my father stepped onto the porch. He stood in the shadows, his face obscured, and I felt my heart stop. He stood there silently, observing Sophie and me. The moment stretched into eternity. What had he seen? What did he know? The three of us froze, and in that silence, I understood that nothing would ever be the same again.